It's always lovely to open up the revision kit and check your answer and see, yes, you got every number absolutely correct. Frankly, in the exam, under exam conditions, that just isn't going to happen. And the essential thing for currency hedging and interest rate hedging isn't to get every number right. Wonderful if you can do it, but it's to get the basics right and to get perhaps most of the numbers right on a good day. And of course to get onto the discussion areas, which always account for a significant number of marks. So the scenario in this question is reasonably straightforward. We are at the 30th of November, and in 6 months' time we're expecting a receipt in Swiss francs, and we are an American company. Okay, and then we've got some details on forwards, futures and options. A few comments from the non-executive, and then in the requirements we have to use the derivatives. So this is futures and options, to consider which gives the better outcome, and we're told specifically to look at what if options are exercised and what if they're not exercised. But there are other parts to the question too. We've got some simple discussion parts in part B and an explanation of how mark to market works with some reasonably straightforward numbers in part C. And it would be a real shame to tie yourself up in knots in part A and not get on to B and C, and perhaps not even get on to scoring professional marks. Even in part A we can see the word evaluate, and evaluate means judge. Yes, there are going to be some calculations, but it's not all calculations. And for that reason I think it's really important to begin your answer in the word processing document and to start to explain what you're doing as you set up futures and options. You can then link in to the spreadsheet to show key calculations, and that should also mean that your spreadsheet isn't overwhelmed with narrative. It's really difficult to put meaningful narrative into a spreadsheet anyway, and it should help you to access these professional marks because you'll be explaining what you're doing, not just producing a set of numbers. Okay, so let's start with the spreadsheet function just to pick up a couple of the initial points, and we'll start with the futures calculations. Okay, so just setting up a few simple workings. 12.3 million of Swiss francs is what we require cover for, and the contracts are in Swiss francs. And so we can say, ideally we would like 98.4 contracts. Now you can round that up to 99 or down to 98. I'm going to assume 98 contracts. What that means is that 98 times 125,000 has been covered and 50,000 is not hedged. So the difference between these two numbers, the 50,000, I can either leave unhedged or I could hedge using a forward contract, and that's what I'm going to assume is done. It's not a massive amount of money. If you ignored it, it's not the end of the world, and if you assume a different number, that's fine. But I'm going to assume the rate given in the question for a 6-month forward of 1.0358, which is the worst bit of the spread, which is the bit of the spread you should take. And very importantly, when I go from Swiss francs into dollars, the exchange rates are all quoted to the Swiss franc, and they're telling you that a Swiss franc is worth more in terms of dollars. So I'm multiplying the 50,000 to get to 51,790. So these are going to be 98 contracts to sell. But that sort of narrative, personally, I would put into the Word document, and I'll show you that in a second. Okay, so that's the number of contracts I'm going to need. The outcome, well, here we're looking primarily for speed, a really quick way of analysing futures. So I need to calculate the effective futures rate, and I'm going to do that by using the concept of basis, which is the difference between the future and the spot. So I'm using a June future because that gives me cover to the transaction date. It's now the end of November. The June futures rate at the end of November is 1.0369, and the spot rate, taking the least attractive rate, because that's what I'd be offered, is 1.0292, and the difference is the basis, future less spot. And the basis of 0.0077 exists because of the difference in timing between the end of November, which is where we are now, and the end of the June contract, which is in 7 months' time. Now, by the end of May, I've only got 1 month until the end of the June future contract, and so only 1/7 of that basis will remain. And once I've got that closing basis figure, I can calculate my effective rate. There are different ways of doing this. The approach I'm using here is to use the opening rate, the opening futures rate, less the closing basis. And that gives me 1.0358, and that is my effective rate. And the most accurate way of using that is to say everything that I've hedged, top of the screen, the amount hedged on my 98 contracts, well, that's tied into 1.0358. So multiplying by 1.0358, that's the outcome. And then I'm not forgetting the amount that I've hedged using the forward. Top of the screen, top right, 51,790 in dollars. And so adding those numbers together, that's my net outcome. Now I can also get that outcome more quickly if you prefer. You'll lose a mark for not showing the unhedged amount, but ignoring all of the calculations for underhedging, I could simply have taken 12,300 and multiplied by this effective rate, and I get the same answer. So in the exam, that's quite a useful shortcut approach to use. So those are my calculations, but going back to what I said at the beginning, it's really important to put as much narrative as you can into your Word document. So for example, if I was writing out my answer, this is what it would look like. Into the word processing document, I'd be putting my narrative. I'd be saying how I've set up the future. I'd be referencing in to my workings as and when necessary. So working 1, 98 contracts, working 1, the hedge using the forward, and so on. So I think that's really important, and that allows you to explain the meaning of your numbers, to make sure that you've got the basic setup correct, which is absolutely crucial in currency hedging, and to talk about the meaning of the numbers once you've got the options figures too, and that's also going to give access to the professional marks. Now turning to currency options. Right, it would be nice to be able to consider scenarios when options are and are not exercised, but under exam conditions, if I just did one of those, that would be great. And then I could move into parts B and C, bang, bang, I've got my answer, it's a good answer, I get pass marks, I pass the exam. And that's what we're all in this to do. So we try and keep this as simple as possible, we try and get the basics right. So we've got to get the setup right. Let's start with that. Okay, so the setup. Setting up the option on the 30th of November, it's largely copy and paste from your futures, and that's basically what I've got there. The only difference is that the contract I require is a put option. It's an option to sell, and I might mention that. But as I get into the calculations, it becomes clear there's nothing new to do here. So it's just copy and paste, it's 98 contracts. There's an underhedge. So that's exactly what we had before. And then in my next working, I've started with some narrative. To be honest, that's only for this debrief. That would be in my word processing document. The only difference with an option is that I've got to pay a premium for it up front. Okay, that's fine, but I wouldn't put it in the Excel document in the spreadsheet. The premium for put options is given in the question. These are at the exercise price of 1.0375, that's the only one we're given. They're put options and they need to be in June, so it's 0.86 and that's in US cents per Swiss franc. So how many Swiss francs are we looking at? Well, that's the amount that I've hedged multiplied by the cents, and if I'm converting into dollars I've got to divide that by 100, and that gives me my 105,350. And then if I exercise, well, all that happens if I exercise is I take the amount hedged, which is the 12,250, and multiply it by the exchange rate to put it into dollars, it should say here. And that gives me 12,709. I deduct the premium, which I've just calculated, add on the forward receipt. Now, if you've done all those calculations based on the 12.3 million Swiss francs, basically that's fine. And if you ignored the forward receipt, it's a very small issue. It doesn't matter. And of course, if you've been consistent with futures and options, that's great, because if you've ignored the underhedge with both, you're not affecting the comparison between the two techniques. So that's where I'd love to get to, and then to be honest, if I waved goodbye to part A and went on to parts B and C and did a good job there, I'd be a very happy man. Now, just for the sake of completeness, how could we illustrate an outcome if the option is not used? Well, we could do that by inventing any exchange rate at which the option rate is worse. So if I took any exchange rate above 1.0375 and did those calculations again, I'd be fulfilling the requirement. And what the solution does here, and it is one valid approach, is to say, well, the future gives us an outcome of 12,743.40. If the spot rate moved in our favour and we're using options, we could actually get up to that level. What would the exchange rate have to be for that to happen? Well, the outcome would have to be 12,743.40, but I have to pay a premium with options, and so I'd need to be collecting receipts of 12,845,690, and so crudely that gives me an exchange rate of 1.0444, and that comes from the 12,840,690 divided by 12,300, and that's my 1.0444. That's one approach. Yes, you could do that, or you could just invent a more favourable exchange rate and show the outcome with the option not being exercised. It can take you a little bit down a black hole and really consume time. There aren't going to be many marks for it. Much better to be spending that time and effort in the discussion areas. For example, in part B, lots of easy discussion points to be made. Exchange traded derivatives can be exercised over a range of dates, are easy to buy and sell to adjust your position, are normally much more flexible in that sense compared to over-the-counter derivatives. And they're also likely to have lower premiums because they're standard agreements. They haven't been designed specifically for you. So easy to pick up marks in part B, and then in part C, you're again working in your word processing document and supplementing it with some data from the spreadsheet. I'm just going to quickly work through the numbers here and leave you to look at the rest of the solution yourselves. So in part C, we are told that there's an initial margin of 1,450 and that the value of a tick is 12.5 US dollars. If the exchange rate moves in such a way that creates losses by 0.0011, that's 11 tick movements, where a tick is 0.0001. It's the minimum movement in the exchange rate. 11 times 12.5 gives me 137.5 loss per contract. Now, if there's a maintenance margin of 1,360, which we're given in the question, and we've started with an initial margin of 1,450 and we've made that loss, we've gone below the maintenance margin. And so for each contract, I think the most likely outcome here is that you would have to top up the contract by 47.5, 98 contracts times 47.5, there would be the need to pay 4655 to the futures exchange on that particular day. And then on the next day and the next day, there'll be different adjustments to make. And this is one of the main reasons why companies don't particularly enjoy using currency futures. So the main takeaway from this debrief is get the basics right. Don't worry too much about the underhedge on the forward contract. Do worry about setting up your futures and options contracts correctly and getting on to the discussion parts of the question, and using the word processing function to cover the narrative that's required to explain the meaning of the numbers that you're creating in your spreadsheet.